My father stood up at his own retirement party, tapped his champagne glass with a fork until the room of nearly 100 people went quiet, and announced that he was changing his will, and that I, his only daughter, would be getting nothing. He said it with a smile. That's the part people never believe when I tell this story. He wasn't crying, he wasn't shaking with anger. He delivered it like a punchline, like he'd been waiting all night for the right moment to say it in front of an audience. What he didn't know, what he'd never once bothered to ask about in the 4 years since my grandfather passed away, was that the will he was so proud of updating didn't actually control the one asset that mattered. Because 18 months earlier, my grandfather had already moved everything into an irrevocable trust, with my name on it, specifically so my father could never touch it. He spent an entire retirement party publicly disowning me from an inheritance he no longer had the authority to give or take away. This is the story of the night my father tried to humiliate me on his way out of his career, and the paperwork that made sure it cost him everything on his way into retirement. My name is Rachel. I'm 31, and my father, Gary, spent his entire adult life running a mid-sized logistics company that my grandfather, his own father, had built from a single delivery truck in the 1970s. My grandfather, Walter, was the kind of man who noticed things, who paid attention to how people actually behaved, not just what they said at holidays. I was the older child. My brother Mark is 28, and for as long as I can remember, my father treated the company, the family reputation, and eventually the inheritance itself as things that belonged to Mark by default, simply because he was the son. It showed up early. When I was 16 and got accepted into an advanced business program, my father's first comment was that it was cute I was interested, but that the company will go to your brother eventually, so don't get too invested. I was 16. Mark was 13 and had shown zero interest in the business at that point. He was more interested in video games than spreadsheets, but the assumption was already locked in place, unquestioned, like gravity. I went and built a career anyway, in supply chain consulting, ironically adjacent to the exact industry my father and grandfather had spent their lives in. I was good at it. I got promoted twice in 4 years. My father's reaction, both times, was some version of "that's nice," delivered with the same energy he'd use if I'd told him about a parking spot I found. My grandfather was different. Walter actually asked me questions about my work, real ones, the kind that meant he was listening. He'd call me on Sunday afternoons just to talk through a client problem I'd mentioned, offering advice from 40 years of running his own company. My father was in the room for some of those calls and never once joined the conversation. There's one moment from around that time I still think about. I made partner track at my firm the same month Mark got written up at his first job out of college for missing 3 shifts in a row. At a family dinner that week, my father spent 20 minutes reassuring Mark that some jobs just aren't the right fit yet, and asking if he wanted help finding something more suited to him. When my grandmother mentioned my promotion at the same table, my father said, "That's the plan, isn't it?" since the company was never really hers to inherit, and moved on to dessert before anyone could respond. I remember sitting there realizing the sentence answered a question I hadn't consciously asked yet, whether any of this was actually about Mark being ready, or about a decision that had already been made long before either of us had done anything to earn it. Here's the detail that matters most for how this story ends, so hold on to it. About 2 years before he passed away, my grandfather told me, privately, over coffee, that he was handling some things about how the company and his personal assets would eventually be distributed. He didn't go into specifics. He just said, with a small, knowing smile that I didn't fully understand until much later, "I've seen how your father treats you, Rachel. I've also seen what you're capable of. Those 2 things are going to matter, eventually." I didn't ask him to clarify. I assumed it was just grandfather sentiment. I had no idea, at the time, that he meant it literally. My grandfather passed away 4 years ago, quietly in his sleep, at 83. The funeral was the kind of event where half the room was employees who'd worked for him for decades and genuinely loved him, and the other half was family quietly wondering what was going to happen to the company. The will reading happened about 3 weeks later, and on the surface, it looked straightforward. The company's operational control passed to my father. As expected, he'd been co-running it for years by then anyway. The family home went to my grandmother, who was still alive at the time. A handful of specific personal items went to various grandchildren. Nothing dramatic, nothing that raised eyebrows in the room. What almost nobody in that room knew, because my grandfather had set it up quietly through his own estate attorney, separate from the will itself, was that 18 months before he passed, he had moved a substantial personal investment portfolio, completely separate from the company, into an irrevocable trust. Not mentioned in the will, not distributed through probate. Simply already placed into a structure that existed independently, with a named trustee and named beneficiary. Me. I found out about this the way you'd expect, a phone call from my grandfather's estate attorney, a man named Mr. Voss, about 6 weeks after the funeral. He explained, in that careful, unhurried way lawyers talk when they know they are about to change someone's life with one conversation, that my grandfather had established the trust specifically to be outside the will's reach, that it was irrevocable, meaning it couldn't be undone, contested, or redirected by anyone, including my father, and that as the named beneficiary, I would begin receiving distributions from it starting immediately, with the full principal transferring to my outright control on my 35th birthday. I asked him, somewhat stunned, why my grandfather had done it this way instead of just putting it in the will. Mr. Voss's answer has stayed with me word for word ever since. Your grandfather told me directly that he didn't trust your father not to find a way to talk you out of your share or guilt you into signing something away for the good of the family. He wanted it to be legally impossible for anyone to touch, including himself if he changed his mind, and including your father if he tried. He also told me something I hadn't asked about but have thought about often since. The portfolio itself wasn't small. Investments my grandfather had built quietly over decades, entirely separate from the company, the kind of money he'd apparently never once mentioned at a single family dinner or holiday, because, in Mr. Voss's words, your grandfather didn't believe in showing people a hand before he was ready to play it. It was strange, hearing a lawyer describe my own grandfather like a man who'd been running a decades-long game none of us knew we were pieces in. I asked one more question. I asked if my father knew. Mr. Voss said no. My grandfather had specifically instructed him to keep the trust's existence confidential unless I asked directly or unless a triggering event made disclosure necessary. For 4 years, I simply didn't bring it up. There was no reason to. My father and I had a distant, cordial relationship, the kind built on avoiding real conversation, and I saw no benefit in detonating that dynamic by announcing I had money he didn't control. I had no idea, 4 years later, that my father would detonate it himself, in front of 100 people, entirely on his own. My father retired last month after 31 years running the company his own father built. The retirement party was held at a banquet hall the company rented out, nearly 100 people, employees going back decades, extended family, a few of his golf friends, the whole production. Mark gave a toast. Several longtime employees gave toasts. It was, for the first 2 hours, a genuinely nice event. About an hour before it happened, I noticed my father doing something he almost never does at events, refilling his own champagne glass without waiting for a server, twice, in under 20 minutes. Mark noticed it too. He mentioned it to me quietly while we were both getting drinks at the bar, joking that Dad's really feeling his own speech tonight. Neither of us thought much of it at the time. In hindsight, I've wondered whether he'd been building up to it all evening, rehearsing the moment in his head the way people do right before they say something they've already decided they're going to say no matter what happens in the room. Then my father stood up, unprompted, near the end of the night, and asked for everyone's attention. I assumed, like everyone else in the room, that he was about to give his own farewell speech, some reflection on 31 years, thanking his father's memory, thanking the employees. That's not what happened. He started by talking about legacy and fairness, language that, in hindsight, I should have recognized as a wind-up. He said that as he moved into retirement, he'd been getting his affairs in order, and that it was important to him to be transparent with the family about how things would eventually be divided. He talked about Mark's dedication to eventually stepping into leadership at the company, a company Mark had, at that point, worked at for exactly 1 year in an entry-level operations role. And then, still smiling, still holding his champagne glass, he said the sentence that ended his own party. And as for Rachel, I think it's time everyone knew that she won't be included in that inheritance. Some children build their own path. That's what she chose, so that's what she'll have. The room did the thing rooms do when someone says something no one expected in a setting where no one can safely react. A long, uncomfortable half-laugh from someone near the back who assumed it was a joke, followed by a silence that made clear it wasn't. One of the longtime warehouse managers, a woman named Denise who'd worked for my grandfather since before I was born, actually set her glass down on the table like she needed both hands free for whatever was about to happen. I remember looking at Mark, who looked as blindsided as I felt, mouthing something like, "What is he doing?" across the table. My phone buzzed in my clutch about 90 seconds later. A text from my cousin Priya, who'd been sitting 2 tables away. "Is he serious right now? Do you want me to say something?" I typed back a single word, "No," and put the phone face down. Some tired, small part of me, the same part that had spent 31 years absorbing versions of this exact message quietly, almost wanted to just let it pass, smile through it, avoid the scene. I sat with that impulse for maybe 10 full seconds. Then I thought about Mr. Voss's phone call 4 years earlier, and about my grandfather's small, knowing smile over coffee, and something in me settled instead of shrank. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think part of what made the rest of the night land the way it did was that I never matched his tone. "Dad," I said, loud enough for the room, but calm enough that people had to actually lean in to hear it, which I think worked in my favor. "I want to make sure everyone understands something, since you've decided to bring this up here." He said, still smiling, clearly expecting me to either cry or leave the room. "Rachel, this isn't the time." "You made it the time," I said, "so let's finish it accurately at least." I told the room, plainly, that my father was talking about his own will. A document that, whenever he eventually passes, would distribute assets that belong to him. I told them that was entirely his right, and I meant that, genuinely. I have never once, in this entire story, disputed my father's right to leave his own money to whoever he chooses. Then I told them that the inheritance he was describing wasn't the only one in this family, and that 4 years ago, my grandfather, his own father, had set up a separate, irrevocable trust, entirely outside the will, naming me directly as the beneficiary, specifically because he didn't trust my father to treat me fairly if it had been left to his discretion. I watched my father's face change in real time, and it's a specific kind of transformation. The confidence draining out of someone who thought he held every piece of information in a conversation, and is realizing, live, in front of 100 people, that he didn't. "That's not," he started, and then stopped, because he clearly had no idea what to say that wouldn't make it worse. Someone near the back, I found out later it was Denise, the same manager who'd set her glass down earlier, said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Well, that's that then," in a tone that somehow managed to sound like she'd been waiting years to say it about something else entirely. A few people actually laughed, the short, involuntary kind people make when tension breaks in a room. And my father's face when a shade of red I'd genuinely never seen on him before. I said, gently, because at that point I genuinely didn't need to be anything but calm, "I didn't bring this up for 4 years, Dad. I didn't need to. You brought it up tonight in front of everyone to make a point about who deserves what in this family. So I think everyone deserves the full picture, not just your half of it." My grandmother, sitting at the front table, put her hand over her mouth. Mark, across the room, put his face in his hands, not in embarrassment for me. I'd learn later, but in something closer to secondhand humiliation for our father, whose plan to publicly diminish me had just publicly diminished him instead. Nobody clapped. Nobody needed to. My father sat back down without finishing his toast, and the DJ, with the good instincts of a man who has worked 200 weddings and exactly one retirement party gone this wrong, quietly put music back on. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't even close to the end of what that night cost him. I just didn't find out the rest of it until weeks later. I want to be honest about something most stories like this skip. The month afterward wasn't triumphant. It was mostly just uncomfortable, in the specific way family conflict is uncomfortable when it happens in front of witnesses who all now have opinions. My father didn't speak to me for 11 days. When he finally called, his opening line was, "You embarrassed me at my own party." I told him I understood why it felt that way, and that I genuinely hadn't planned to say anything. I'd sat in my seat for a full 10 seconds deciding whether to stay quiet, but that I wasn't going to sit in a room and let a room full of people believe a version of events that wasn't true, just to protect him from the consequences of saying it publicly first. He didn't have much of a response to that. There was a long silence, and then he said something that I think was, in his own limited way, as close to an apology as he's capable of. "I didn't know your grandfather did that." I told him I knew he didn't. That was rather the entire point of how my grandfather had set it up. Mark and I have actually gotten closer since that night, which I didn't expect. He called me 2 days later, genuinely rattled, and told me he'd had no idea our father was planning to say any of that, and that he felt sick sitting there while it happened. He also told me something I didn't know, that our father had in fact been quietly pressuring him for the past year to prepare for eventually running the company, despite Mark having shown no real interest and, in his own words to me, barely knowing how the warehouse software works. Mark told our father directly, about a week after the party, that he didn't want to be positioned as the deserving heir in a story that required tearing me down to make sense. I don't know exactly how that conversation went, but Mark and I talk most weeks now, more than we ever did before. My grandmother, for her part, called me the week after and told me quietly that she'd known about the trust the whole time. Walter had told her before he died, and that she'd been waiting, with something between dread and curiosity, to see how long it would take before my father found out the way he apparently needed to find out. Publicly, and on his own terms gone wrong. Denise, the manager who'd set her glass down that night, sent me a message on LinkedIn of all places, about a week later. She said she'd worked for my grandfather for 26 years, that he used to talk about me more than I ever realized, and that she just wanted me to know how much the room actually believed me that night, not him. I hadn't expected to cry over a LinkedIn message, but I did, sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, for reasons that had very little to do with the company and everything to do with feeling, for the first time in a long time, like people outside my immediate family had been paying attention the whole time too. There was a smaller, quieter cost too, one my father never mentioned to me directly. I heard about it from 2 of the longtime employees who'd been at the party. The plan, going into retirement, had always been for my father to stay on in a paid advisory role, chairman emeritus, officially, with a consulting retainer attached, the kind of soft landing a lot of retiring owners negotiate for themselves. That arrangement had never been formalized in writing before the party. Afterward, in the weeks the board spent finalizing his exit terms, it quietly didn't happen. Nobody framed it as a punishment. But 2 people who were in that room told me the same thing, separately. After watching him try to publicly cut off Walter's own granddaughter over money he turned out not to control, the board wasn't eager to keep paying him to stay involved in decisions about the company's future. He found out about that decision over email, not in a room full of people. I don't think that was an accident either. It's been about 5 weeks since the party. My father and I are speaking again, in the careful, somewhat stilted way we always have, but there's something different underneath it now, a kind of clarity that wasn't there before. He knows, in a way he can't pretend not to know anymore, that I have resources and standing in this family that don't run through him, that were never his to grant or withhold in the first place. I think that's genuinely difficult for him, not because he's a cruel person exactly, but because his entire sense of authority in our family was built on being the one who decided who got what, and that authority turned out to be smaller than he believed. I met with Mr. Voss again last week, mostly just to review the distribution schedule ahead of my 35th birthday, when full control of the principal transfers to me. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that my grandfather had left a short letter with the trust documents to be given to me only once the trust was fully active, which, functionally, meant only after some kind of triggering event made it relevant. He handed it to me at the end of our meeting. It was short, handwritten, and dated about 6 months before Walter passed. It said, more or less, "Rachel, if you're reading this, something happened that made it necessary. I'm sorry for whatever that was. I built this so no one could ever again make you feel like you had to earn a place that was already yours. Don't let anyone, including your father, convince you otherwise. Grandpa Walter." I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Mr. Voss's office for a long time after reading that. I called Mark that same night, mostly just to hear a voice that wasn't Mr. Voss's careful, lawyerly calm. He asked if he could read the letter sometime, and I said yes, eventually, though not yet. Some things feel like they need to belong to just one person for a while before you're ready to share them, even with someone you trust completely. He didn't push. He just said, "Grandpa really did see all of it, didn't he?" And I said yes. He really did. As for the company itself, the thing my father spent 31 years running, the thing he assumed would eventually justify everything, including how he treated me. Mark has since told our father directly that he doesn't want to inherit leadership of it by default, and that if it ever comes to him, he wants it to be because he's actually earned the role, not because he was born the right gender for our father's assumptions. Last I heard, they're bringing in an outside operations consultant to evaluate real succession options, rather than assuming Mark simply steps in. I think, in a strange way, that's the most honest conversation this family has had in years, and it only happened because my father tried to publicly diminish me and accidentally diminish the entire premise he'd built his parenting around. I don't think my father is a villain in some cartoonish sense. I think he genuinely believed, his whole life, that sons inherit companies and daughters build their own paths, and he never once examined whether that belief was fair, because it had simply never been challenged. My grandfather challenged it quietly, 4 years in advance, with paperwork instead of confrontation, and it turned out to be the more effective approach by a wide margin. My father walked into that banquet hall expecting to spend his retirement exactly as he'd planned it, comfortable, still consulted, still the one who decided things. He walked out having lost the paid seat at the table he assumed was guaranteed, over a will he no longer fully controlled, in the same room where he tried to announce that I had nothing. I don't know if my father and I will ever have the kind of relationship where he simply says he was wrong, out loud, without qualifying it somehow. I've made a kind of peace with that. What I do know is that he can no longer tell himself, or anyone else, a version of our family where I was the one who chose to walk away from what I was owed. That version died in a banquet hall, in front of 100 witnesses, the night he decided to say it out loud himself. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this: the people who actually see you clearly aren't always the ones who are supposed to. Sometimes it's not a parent, it's a grandparent, a mentor, someone one generation removed from the assumptions everyone else in the family has already agreed not to question. Let them see you. It matters more than you think, sometimes years later, in rooms you can't yet imagine. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in that room, said something the way I did, or stayed quiet and let him have the moment. And if you want to hear what happened when my father tried to bring it up again at Thanksgiving, let me know, because that's its own story. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.